All right, welcome to Florida Legacy Club. We're going to be doing a replay of our local Legacy FNM at PCB Hobby. And to help me with commentary, we've got Nick and Ben. Welcome, guys.
Hey, how's it going?
And hey, I'm Ben. I wasn't at this event, but I tuned in a couple of times from the sidelines. Let's see how it goes.
All right, so starting off on the left, we got Ryan playing lands. Ryan was testing out a new deck. And on the right, we have Trevin. We were really excited to have Trevin and Ronnie join us. They literally just picked up a couple of legacy decks. They borrowed from Austin and they did great. So here we go with game one.
So, Nick, what do you know about Lands versus Delver as a matchup?
I mean, it's a classic matchup if there ever was one. On one you got sort of this non this I guess this different control deck that doesn't really want to play the game like a typical deck does, and then on the other hand you have this highly efficient, streamlined tempo deck. Um, Obviously Delver's most important card in this matchup is Wasteland.
Yep.
And Lands has a lot of game behind it. Urza Saga can just pump up constructs that Lands can't, or sorry, that Delver can't deal with. In addition to the classic making of a 2020 Merit Lage.
Yeah, so I mean, the classic dynamic here is that lands has a lot of lands which are uncounterable and have many important static effects, but there are a few things that lands still does that can and should be countered, like crop rotation to cycle out their lands to perhaps threaten a merit lage or do other important or interesting things, or removal spell on the Delver or DRC that's gonna fly over Urza Saga constructs or just go a little too fast for them. What are these cards that I can't really recognize here because of the alt arts? We've got a
Yeah,
Sphere of Resistance being played after an exploration, but the lands I don't recognize.
that land is a Yavamaya. It's the Lord of the
Forest
Rings
Urberg.
alt art. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So really strong start here from lands, and we don't see a single force. Obviously, Daze wasn't available, and just a land go from
Yeah,
Delver.
getting Sphere of Resistance out is pretty backbreaking, especially early. Like, making all of Delver's spells cost one more, especially even like the free spells like Force of Will, that's just gonna grind them down to a halt. And Delver shouldn't have anything mainboard to remove the sphere, surely, in its list. Not that I would remember.
Yeah, they do not. There's Meltdown post board, but Delver's a deck where Sphere can often make all of their cards, or at least most of the cards they'd play in a matchup, double.
There's
They
a
have
second exploration coming down, and that's deploying even more lands. I believe that's a Mazavith and an Urza Saga.
yeah. So lands really in the driver's seat on this one. Um, Not fetching a red source. That's interesting. I wonder what the Delver player would have in hand.
Oh, the second land must be an Ancient Tomb. That's how the Sphere of Resistance was able to come out turn one alongside an exploration anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that second exploration should have been paid for one more. By the way, that's something that neither player has caught here. But the effect is symmetrical. It wouldn't really have mattered in this spot, but
good
especially with the
catch.
Yavimaya in play. But for our viewers at home, that's one of the important things about the card. It's grinding both players' game plans to a halt, and cards like Urza Saga that you can pump mana into without having to cast spells, you know, our Lance player here is just happy to make a bunch of constructs.
Yeah, so we'll see a construct being made main phase here, tapping the Ancient Tomb for green off of that Yavamaya. Delver did deploy a Delver, their namesake card. Have a
Mhm.
Wasteland available as well. Not going for the waste on the Urza Saga. Probably correct. You need to deploy some threats here, but definitely a feels bad.
Like when you wasteland here, it's like you're basically committing to time walking your opponent. Like going down on lands with a sphere of resistance in play means you're just unable to play one fewer free spell or like no lightning bolts or forces or whatever. I think that's the Tomb Raider Shadow Spear being deployed here as well, which again seems pretty uninteractable from the Delver side. As soon as that goes onto a construct, it's going to be lights out for them in a few turns as the life gain becomes kind of impossible to deal with, at least by
Yep,
my
I will
estimation.
agree. Looks like we have floating of 1 mana and sacking of the Urza Saga, not opting to make a token here. Wonder what the lands player drew that would make that play.
Do you have enough mana to make another token and equip Shadow Spear? You do if you take 2 from the Ancient Tomb, I
Which is,
suppose.
yeah,
Yeah, that's reasonable.
and you tap down your Maze of Ith off that Yavimaya, which I think is totally reasonable. You're gaining 4 or 5 here off of that swing. That's gonna more than cover that Delver uh,
We're
attack.
talk. I think we're talking here about smaller percentage plays here than are realistic because it's not like this construct is getting bolted. Simply having the opportunity to equip this thing at all is and just get in with it for 5 damage. This is already, in my opinion, enough for the Lance player to feel very, very good. It's
I
already
would
out of
agree with you.
bolt range. You've just done what you need to do, and you've held up your Maze of Ith and a crop rotation mana, I guess, in case you need it. That's a
Tarmogoyf being
Goyf?
deployed.
Yes.
That's why we saw the green mana being fetched instead of red.
All of
Goyf is
these
an interesting card. That's not one we've seen in Delver much before, recently anyway. What are your
It's
thoughts
come
on
up
that?
sometimes. Yeah, I mean it's come up sometimes. I see it more in modern than legacy where the Murktide deck, which is much similar to the Delver deck, will decide to go Teamer and splash Goyfs for a bit of a bigger threat on the ground. But both in modern and in legacy, I do think that Questing Druid is currently the more common splash if you're going for a Teamer Delver list because the ability to draw more cards with Seek the Beast, and Questing Druid itself is not really a small body either. Like, it can easily get as big as a Goyf if you just play a few spells for a couple of turns.
Yep.
And sorry for the camera angle. We'll get that fixed a little later in the stream. I think we'll get it adjusted.
Expedition map being cracked here. Did you happen to catch what for? Ah, it's the Dark Depths. Yeah. And the
Dark Depths
Thespian stage.
Thespian stage.
Yeah, we're at an insult to injury here as Marit Lage is just ready to be activated whenever our Lance player wants to here.
Yep. Looks like a double block on the construct. I believe, or no, I'm not actually sure what happened. I think just the Delver blocked.
It looked like a double block, and yeah, the construct is dead. We don't really see what's in all the graveyards here, so I don't know how big this Goyf is, but there's some types. We got Urza Saga Expedition map already, so yeah, that's enough. This construct's going off the board, some life is getting gained, but without a main deck bounce spell of some kind, this Marit Lage is about to get activated.
I will say there is double Wasteland here, so you're going to see a Waste targeting the Urza Saga, so the Delver player is taking the initiative on this fight.
It's true, I mean, you can't try and copy the land and then the Wasteland will go in response.
Yep. So
Yeah.
there's a Dark Depths or Thespian stage gets activated in response, and then the second Wasteland gets cracked.
Yeah.
Because your target's no longer there. It doesn't
It
fizzle
looks like
because you don't have a target. Your target's gone.
someone is conceded.
No, we had a discussion here. The players were just confirming that that Wasteland interaction worked the way the Delver player wanted it to. So we had a quick little sidebar here for a minute.
Dark depths. I wasteland.
But yeah, the
Yeah, I
the,
mean,
the Delver player did concede.
we've removed the target of the ability, so the ability should fizzle, but
Yeah, I guess I'm a little confused. It seems like a strange concession spot for the Delver player. They seem to have
Yeah,
at
it
least
might have been
stabilized
that
the
they
board.
thought it didn't interact that way. I can't remember the conversation.
Okay.
even though the Delver player was a bit on the mend here with the Tarmogoyf in play and some of the threatening lands taken out, there is still a Sphere of Resistance and a Shadow Spear in play. And we don't know what they had left in their hand anyway.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. At that point, I think you're just waiting to see if you draw another threat before your opponent does, right? As the Delver player, you're locked down by that maze, but if you find another Delver or a Dragon's Rage Chandler or Murktide, enough lands to play it, kind of can get you back into the game. Or the lands player on the other side is looking for another copy of Dark Depths or Urza's Saga to push their game plan forward. So I don't think I think there was more game to be played there. I don't
Yeah.
think it was over from either player's point of view. So I guess potentially a bit of an early concession, and I'm still honestly not sure which one conceded. Um,
I was watching the chat. I believe the Delver player was down a game around this point when I came in. So
okay,
yeah, I do believe it is the Delver player's concession.
got it.
Notably here, we were just talking about Tarmogoyf earlier and how it's less favored. It looked pretty decent in this spot. It provided a more immediate big body to actually, double block and threaten the double block onto the construct.
Yep.
Sort of like whether or not that attack was the right thing to be doing there, like being able to like double block into it, like and remove what was probably the Delvers player's biggest threat at the moment. Like we were talking about how not maybe making the second construct isn't even necessary, and that like you can hold up Maze of S for something else, like maybe a big Merc Tide, I don't know. But it turns out that extra body from the Lance player would have been important in that combat because of the potentially unexpected Tarmogoyf.
Yeah. So now we see the post-board games. Delver going first since they lost. Looks like classic Fetch Volcanic Island Delver start from them. Lance player I see is a Sphere in hand. I believe they just drew an Ancient Tomb. So potentially we'll see something similar to their game one starting play.
Yeah, but this time the Delver player has access to Daze and has a Delver on the board already. The die roll really does matter with these kinds of swingy openings, as is not uncommon in Legacy in general, but perhaps particularly so in this matchup where the difference between Delver having a Wasteland on the play and on the draw can be quite massive, as like playing your one land and getting it wasted while the Delver still has a mana to spend every turn is much more backbreaking than forcing them to use it as their only play that turn.
Yeah. So now we're seeing an Ancient Tomb followed by a pair of Mox Diamonds discarding. I
The
believe that's
combo.
Espen Sage. Yeah, the combo. 4 mana being tapped.
So we're going in on something
Choke. So it looks like
interesting.
one colorless floating, or potentially one
Green or something?
green
Because the
something.
second Mox Diamond probably doesn't need to be tapped right away. I think I saw an exploration in hand, but maybe I wasn't able to read that correctly. Or maybe that isn't an ancient tomb.
Now we're seeing a Daze being played on the choke.
Yeah, I can't really recognize a lot of these alt arts these days. You'll have to forgive me. So we are paying for the days here using the extra ancient tomb mana, it
Yeah,
seems, because the choke is on the board. The days is being used to, I guess, untap the island in a sort of cheeky fashion, I guess. Delver gets flipped to Lightning Bolt, and these baubles are entering the fray. It looks like a pretty good start for Delver. Like, Lightning Bolts are nice to close out the race and take out constructs, and these baubles are card draws. Looks at the opponent's deck twice, ready to draw 2 cards on the upkeep.
yeah. Despite the choke, I still think Delver's favored at the current moment.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think the choke does much here at the moment unless the Lance player can come in with something important right now.
Yeah, they really
There's
need a Maze of Ith or something to stabilize.
there's a wasteland, right? That's the Lord of the Rings wasteland,
Yeah, that's the Lord of the Rings Wasteland,
and a
followed
Soul
by
Guardian cave.
a Shadow Spear taking out a bauble, so potentially being able to keep their, or sorry,
Not
taking out a
Shadow,
Daze.
not Shadowspear, Soul Guide Lantern.
That's yeah,
Yeah,
apologize. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
yeah,
So tech that could potentially keep their opponent off of Murktide here.
and helps with Delirium, but the bolt is also just like, yep,
Yeah.
we're gonna bolt them in response just to use the mana, and that's probably where that bolt was going. Like at least 50% of the time, anyway. That Delver's just going to keep coming in. The life pressure really matters, and this isn't a DRC. You can't crack this Soul Guide Lantern to take him off of Delirium, so you have to
Right.
draw your card, look for more answers.
And there is a Maze of Ith,
Yep,
so
that's an
Lance
answer.
player now stable, and his Sphere.
Delver player fetched green, by the way. So with just one, or did they just play that land rather than fetch it? Yeah. So
I don't know. It's a little difficult to see the graveyard, and I don't. Yes, they just played it. I don't think
yeah,
they. Yeah, they. No option to filter.
Sphere gets forced. Second Sphere gets played after it gets
Oh,
forced using the Ancient Tomb. We have Maze of Ith, but Lance player at 7.
yeah. Looks like that Tropical Island untapped. It should not have under the choke. Um, it needed to tap to pay for the Force of Will because of the sphere. And it looks like we're going to see a Wasteland on Mazavith followed by a Surgical
Surgical
Extraction.
extraction on
So
Mazadith, yeah.
yeah, I don't know how much untapping this trop will end up mattering, but even if it was still tapped, I still think Delver's in the driver's seat after Maze being taken out of the deck completely.
I mean, these are definitely just going to be the foibles of paper magic, right? Like, both players are sort of responsible for keeping track of a lot of things that, can very, very easily be missed on the board state,
Yeah.
regardless of whether or not they matter.
Yep.
Only two mazes, it seems, but
Two
I don't know.
mazes. I don't know if that's standard, but that seems about what
Yeah, it
a
seems
Lance
right
deck would want. Yeah.
for a land that, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't produce mana.
It
It
doesn't
just,
produce mana unless you have a Yavimaya in play. You are
yeah,
correct. And you're a deck that has land tutors in it, so
yeah.
you can typically find it if you need it.
But redundancy is also important against things like Wasteland, which is why it's good to have a second copy of some of these utility lands.
I'll pay 2, and I'm gonna eat the.
Um, that's another card that I don't recognize. We're
That's
surgically
a
fears in
yeah.
response, though.
That's an Altart Life from the Loam, so it looks like
Oh,
Surgical is taking out the Thespian stage in response. So the
oh, the
Lance
Thespian
player's
save.
only win condition at this point is Urza Saga, and having to tap down to 5, they don't have much time to come back.
Yeah, so Life Alone um, brings up to 3 lands back to your hand from your graveyard, and it has Dredge 3, which can keep putting cards into your graveyard by replacing your draw step with Life from the Loam, basically.
So,
um,
so as somebody who often targets graveyards with surgical in the lands matchup, I often wonder, do I wait and then target their surgical or target their loam after it's in their graveyard? What do you guys think?
Um,
Taking out the win conditions seems fine here. It's in response to the loam for something that, the Lance player clearly wanted to get out of the graveyard, and you as the Delver player in this context have the initiative in this game. So I think it's perfectly fine to take the stages here.
looks like the Lance player is conceding here.
At 2 life, yeah, sure seems
Yeah,
right.
Jason, I will say I think it's not necessarily matchup dependent, but it's board state dependent, right?
Okay.
If you're a more grindy control deck, then often, yeah, I guess it's one of those things of if you could take them off of Urza's Saga or part of the combo, then it could be worth hitting one of those lands. But um, if you're not hitting a land that is important to you, right, something that can produce Merit Lage or Wasteland, if you're a deck that cares about it, it's probably best to hit the Life of Loam just because of the amount of value that it can grind out over time. But you know, hitting some of the important lands can really devastate these land stacks.
Yeah, many decisions in Magic are context dependent. Even if you are a control deck, you can look at your own hand and see it's like, do I have an immediate answer to Merit Lage? Do I have
Yeah,
these cards? Because if you do, then you want your opponent to be picking up these cards and trying to go for a combo that isn't going to work because it takes them a lot of time and effort to do so.
yeah. And we didn't really talk about it much last time, but these are post board games. So what kind of cards are you expecting players to bring in here?
Um,
Obviously, Surgical's a big one that we saw.
that's true. I don't really consider myself an experienced pilot of either of these decks, so I'm not really sure what they could possibly be bringing in here. Um, it's possible that the Delver player has some kind of bounce spells that they might use for Merit Lage. If they have that, they would be bringing him in, but I'm not really sure about that.
So I
Yeah,
just got past the deck list for the Delver deck. Um, looks like there's uh, um, a Submerge that can potentially be brought in, Surgical Extraction. Um, I could even see a Sylvan Library being brought in. This isn't really a matchup that lands doesn't really pressure your life total unless it's a chunk of 20 at a time for the most part.
Yeah, Sylvan Library I think is a reasonable include. I didn't even consider that in a Delver sideboard, but that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense for some of the control decks. Library is not really a card that sees much legacy play anymore just because of how it interacts with Orcish Bowmasters, but
Uh,
it's still a powerful card, and I can see it being
Delver
a
trigger. That's
potentially
it.
useful sideboard option
Uh,
against some of these bigger
I'm gonna break
Beans
one.
control decks to help the Delver player keep step.
I mean, even if we're talking about draw engines for one in a green enchantments, it sure seems like Beans is more popular these days, just
Yeah,
in general, than Sylvan Library.
One, two
Because
back.
ultimately, Sylvan Library is like a
Delver
selection
trigger.
engine past a certain point. You can't pay 4 life every turn and expect that to go well for
Pass the
you.
turn.
yep. So the Delver player starting off with a green land looks like they revealed a lightning bolt to this Delver,
Three.
but the lands player is currently stable with the Maze of Ith, Yava Maya, Mox Diamond start.
Yep. So even with the Delver coming in, Lance player has some time before perhaps the Maze of Ith gets wastelanded. Um, Delver player is gonna find a red source with this fetch, so they're not color screwed for long. But the Lance player needs to do something proactive. Okay, we are taking the Delver player off of that green mana.
I think that yeah, that might be to just keep them off as much mana as possible, which is a reasonable strategy.
Yeah,
That looks like a
Crucible of
Crucible
Worlds.
of Worlds.
So yeah, we're gonna get that lock going. Delver player fetching in the face of this.
Yeah, that's assuredly game over if it resolves. Just being able to waste lock your opponent is super powerful.
Bring out another Trop
And a
and
Spell
spell
Pierce.
piercing it. Yeah, okay.
I'm a little surprised to see Spell Pierce post board from the Delver deck against the Lance matchup, but definitely comes in big here.
I mean, if we're talking about countering a very early threat, then perhaps it makes sense. Like, um, Lance is not gonna have too much extra mana if they're trying to pay for things like Sphere of Resistance or Exploration or Crop Rotation early. So maybe you can just get them with it. But
Here you
if you're on the draw, then maybe you don't get the chance to even lock out a Sphere of Resistance. So it could be a risky move leaving that in.
Yeah, Delver player using the opportunity while Maze is tapped to get in for 3. All
Yep.
these little points of damage, can add up. That's how you end up threatening your opponent. Second Wasteland here, taking them off the second green source.
Surely there aren't any more green sources in the Delver's deck. Like, I haven't seen too many tropical islands in these three-color lists.
Those are the only 2 green sources in this deck. So now the Delver player no longer has access to green.
this thing.
Um, Potentially keeping them off of Tarmogoyfs. So we'll see how big that comes into play here.
Is that the Surveil land?
That is in fact the Surveil land. I believe it's
Yeah.
called Thundering
They do.
Falls.
Yep.
I'm mad awkward because I've only got two
These
tropical
Surveil lands,
islands.
man, they've really impressed me. They seem to have a lot of utility in Legacy.
I mean, I'm still pretty mid on them. I think they're just an easy include in any format in any deck with fetch lands, but like,
Yeah, I'm gonna
you
get
know,
I'll surveil.
people are it's easy to get really excited over one surveil, but it's just one surveil. Sometimes you leave it on top and it's a nice information. Sometimes you sort of got a little bit of card selection out of it, but you did end up having to fetch a tap land. It improved the situations in which you did have to fetch a tap land and gave you a lot more play, but the ceiling on them is not particularly high regardless.
Sure, but as you said, it's a
Yep.
fetch format, right? And I mean, fetch lands, I think it would be hard for anyone to disagree that they're the most powerful lands in Magic. What they enable is very format defining in both Legacy, Modern, and Vintage, quite frankly. Um, and just having that extra little bit of utility in your deck can often give you the edge, right? Sometimes even
I'll
not
respond.
if you're
I'm gonna
the
brainstorm.
the graveyard based deck that gets the cool big surveil of throwing a Traxa in the yard or something like that. But just the extra look at a card can make the difference if you're digging for one thing.
Yep. So Maze of Ith gets wastelanded. We get another Maze of Ith, so we're back at parity. We're wastelanding another source and then brainstorming in response. So
Draw a card I can't
Delver
cast.
player is still I don't think sweating this game just yet, unless they have 3 or 4 Tarmogoyfs in their hand that they can't use. But
Yeah, really, Delver players just looking for threats at this point. Yeah, we're seeing the classic land destruction getting thrown in both directions from probably the most two historically renowned wasteland decks in the format. Ponder here keeps it on top.
yep, we knew about one of those cards from the brainstorm, so we still like it, or we put it down 2 cards deeper. Yeah, Mazavith does untap the thing that you Mazavith, which is not really relevant a lot of the time, but hey, it still gets to block. That's cool. Up Tabernacle's in play.
Tabernacle, another thing to tax your opponent's mana. Really good after I think we've seen 3 wastelands in this game. So Delver really being kept limited on resources.
Pay for Delver.
So he pays for the Delver,
How annoying.
goes and fetches another land.
Hey, thanks for the follow.
And hopefully we can see another Delver or DRC come out. It's basically time for it here. We've selected quite a few cards. Lands player hasn't put any stacks pieces out outside of just blowing up Delver's lands. But no, it's another Ponder. We're gonna keep looking. We've got time. We're shuffling.
Yeah, lots of cantripping here. I think keeping Ponder off of Ponder makes sense. You're really just looking for threats, and anything that lets you see one more card is really what you need, right? You've really all the time in the world, but you need to close the gap at some point.
Yeah, the Lands player, though they have the destruction, doesn't really have the inevitability the same way that the Delver player does with all of their cantrips.
While we get the camera adjusted here, thanks for hanging out, chat. Thank you for the follow. We're doing a replay of our local Legacy FNM. We do this every other Friday here in Panama City, and we also do a Legacy monthly, and we've got a 1K coming up on May 18th. So if you're interested in any of that, or if you enjoy Legacy and Vintage content, whether you're watching on Twitch or YouTube, be sure to follow. Thank you.
Life of the Loam gets forced here, which was presumably going to bring back 3 Wastelands. Is that a Caracas?
That's a Caracas, yes. And now we're going to see a surgical on Life from the Loam. That makes a lot of sense why you would force that here. Force never feels good on Life from the Loam, but if you have the surgical follow-up, then you're actually going places.
I mean, the Force had immediate impact as well. If you just let it resolve, there's just 3 Wastelands going in the hand. But yeah,
Correct.
and here's where it makes sense to surgical for the Loams instead of the Wastelands. I think you do have time as the Delver player, and if the Loams are going to be left in the graveyard dredging you more targets, it is going to give the land player that inevitability that previously the Delver player had a monopoly on. So.
Yep. Now we see a second threat from the Delver player.
Yeah, the video is pixelated. Sorry about that. Apparently it's just an issue, but that will improve as we get later in the video.
I don't recognize this land from the Lands player that he's put on top of the Caracas.
Yeah, it's an interesting tech land. I believe it makes your lands tap for white or green as long as it's in your graveyard.
Oh, it's that one that gets put in those weird decks sometimes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so being used here to turn your mazes and dark depths into lands that produce mana. I cannot recall the name of this card though.
There's another Dark Depths. Now the Delver player has a clock though. But even though those 2 lands are locked down, paying for those creatures, it is 2 creatures to 1 Mazavith. 3 damage is getting through every time. Swords to the Delver, or is it the DRC? And it's good, so we're back down to 1 creature. No response from the Delver player. We are removing ice counters from Dark Depths manually.
On the slow grind.
Yeah, I mean, let's think about how fast can we get this Dark Depths online. If we have one more land, we can start. Well, two more. I guess Maze of Ith is continually being locked down, so we'll be able to pay twice for a long time. We'll be able to tap the Dark Depths itself for mana and these are the lands, and now we don't even need to do that. We'll have a mana free for things like crop rotation or swords. It'll take, 5 turns to get this ready, so Delver has 5 turns to find another reason for the lands player to die.
And even then, it's not game over necessarily. The Lance player has lots of blockers, and I believe Submerge is the only removal spell for Merit Lage, so at least a one-outer.
I believe the
The
utility land was Riftstone Portal. I just put the link in chat.
Yep.
yes, that is the name of that thing. But Delver has a clock again. Lance player seemingly at 11 life, going down to 8.
So taking 3 a turn, and it's not pretty, but this is what Delver wants to be doing.
And they can have any number of bolts in hand to increase the clock. Lands isn't gaining life.
Yep.
This damage is all relatively permanent.
Once you fall below 6 life, you really start to worry if you haven't seen a single lightning bolt from your Delver opponent.
One card in hand from the Lance player, and they aren't on any counter magic that matters. You can just stop paying for your creatures and bolt them twice. Urza Saga coming in. If Lance player can find a Soul Guide Lantern, a construct could block a DRC.
What a weird race.
That would be nice.
What a weird race.
Yeah, Lance player is still definitely not out of this game. You can still always find a Thespian stage and flip the narrative, but Urza's Saga, even connecting once with a construct equipped with a Shadow Spear can also be the game.
Yeah.
Looks like the lands player is at 5 life.
Yeah, so it's really this turn. If Lance player has something to stall the board for one more turn, we feel less nervous about bolts. We feel better about Saga fetching us something that'll help us gain life or remove the graveyard and start getting our own offensive plan going.
Yep.
Wasteland.
Wasteland, that's massive.
Yeah, it's possible the Delver player was holding Wastelands in their hand for quite some time now. I don't think we've seen many of them this game, so deploying them strategically here is nice.
So I see the attack happening before wasting the Maze of Ith. I'm wondering what the reason behind that might be.
I don't think Maze of Ith is the priority here.
Your
Well,
opponent's at 5 life, right?
yeah, it
If you
is.
connect, you win the game.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I feel like if your opponent has swords, but they're not representing swords, so it's like you could waste Saga.
okay, so really worried about the combo here, trying to take out the Dark Depths.
That does go away. Saga doesn't make another construct. What are we looking
Now,
for
I've
here?
seen this happen twice, where the lands player has not made a construct off of the Urza's Saga.
I didn't know if it was just my shit.
Wondering if potentially they just didn't know that Urza Saga could make a second construct, or if there's some sort of rationale behind it. I don't
It's
see
true
what
that we do have a lot of mana in this situation. Soul Guide Lantern is a nice pull,
I mean, I don't think it matters. Because I have 4 different card types.
looks like
but
the Delver
it's the
player
kind of
was
pull
siding
that
with. Sorry, go ahead, man.
it's just the kind of pull that represents that you might have an answer to one of these flyers, because if you don't, you are just kind of dead.
Agreed.
Pretty much. Pretty much.
Use the colorless floating and draw a card. Sure.
Getting cracked to draw a card.
We're looking for more answers. We're looking for help here.
You almost had a merit lead, dude. 1 turn away.
Looks like Beseiju, Ancient Tomb in hand from the lands player.
That doesn't look like help.
I would agree with you there.
Yeah, I think this was just a game where, regardless of many of the considerations that we were talking about, the Lance player just gave the Delver player too much time. Like, almost anything that they can do now is backed up by counter magic and wastelands in a large enough quantity that it's difficult for the Lance player to get out from underneath that pressure.
Yeah, and I think we saw 6 or 7 wastelands between the two players here in this game 3. So lots of land destruction happening here.
Wasteland is a heck of a card.
Paid for one.
I could have, but I'm gonna lightning bolt.
Okay.
And there's the bolt. Yeah, we just didn't pay for either creature, and we
I don't
don't.
have counter magic in here.
There's the GG.
I did. You could.
So okay, so that was actually a really cool play from Ryan. I don't know if you caught it, but besieging the land, knowing that the Delver player probably doesn't have very many fetchable lands at this point off of the Besagio, ends up not being able to find one, meaning that they couldn't pay for both of their flying creatures at their upkeep because of the Tabernacle, meaning
Yeah,
that Mazavith would potentially be able to lock down the other threat.
I
Delver
had
player did have the bolt though.
Yeah, I hadn't been counting the lands that have been coming out of the Delver
It's
player, but it's
Jason. The deck is called Stifle Knot.
No, it's called Lava Spur, bro.
All right,
I'll,
I'll
I'll
learn
fix it in
that,
a
I
second.
guess.
but yeah, no, I mean it's true. It's like in these matches, especially as we're sitting here commentating, and it's obviously much more important if you're a player to keep track of these things. It's like you waste 2 tropical islands, you waste like 2 volcanic islands, you keep track of what they're fetching. It's like how many lands does the Delver player have left? Do they run a basic island? Do they run 4 volcanics? You kind of have to be in the know for a lot of these things in order to be able to confidently make a play like besieging somebody's land to get them off of mana to pay for their creatures. It's an
Yeah,
interesting line and a good one.
yeah.
Stifle Lot. Yeah, so I was watching one of your games, Nick, and I was like, all right, what are we doing? What are we doing? And then, like, then I saw what we were doing, and I was like, okay,
So
we're stifled on it.
yeah, so I was the player on the left here playing Stifle Knot. And I think this first game in particular really shows the power of Lava Spur Boots, which is why I think Jason was kind of making the comment that it was the or that was Lava Spur uh, uh, brew deck.
Again, this is a replay of our local Legacy FNM at PCB Hobby here in Penwell City, Florida. Had a great turnout. Really excited to have Ronnie and Trevin join us. Literally just picking up a couple Legacy decks for the first time, and they did a great job piloting those decks. So thanks to everybody that came out.
And what's Ronnie on here? Control?
Yeah, Beanstalk Control.
Yeah. So the idea behind a Stifle deck, for those of you who are non-familiar, is that Phyrexian Dreadnought is a 1 mana 12/12 with trample that has this unfortunate enter the battlefield trigger that you have to sacrifice unless you sacrifice 12 power of other creatures. And so Stifle will use a variety of tricky effects to make it so that you can actually keep your 1 mana 12/12. You can phase it out so that it doesn't see itself, it's not there when the trigger resolves, so you don't have to sacrifice it, and then when it comes back in, it's not entering the battlefield, or you can prevent the enter the battlefield trigger or counter it. There are lots of creative ways to get this thing to stick, and now that we're in an Urza Saga world and just living in it, you can get Phyrexian Dreadnought and other things like Lava Spur Boots with the Saga. So
Yeah,
we'll have to see how that goes.
yep, really good explanation there. Lands player mull on a mull to 6. We'll see if they go down to 5 or looks like they're keeping this.
Okay, ready?
Control player, you mean?
Thank you.
I will fetch.
And yeah, Beanstalk control. We've gone over this as well. Like up the Beanstalk is a really important card these days. There are plenty of 5 mana spells that you can cast for free or nearly free, and you can draw cards off of that, or you can just cast Alurian Revealed and draw 4+ cards for your normal cost of 5 mana.
Now we're
This
seeing a Proxy Tundra getting played, sort of a joke on the lands set that Magic released a couple or the basic land set that Magic released a couple moons ago.
The full
The
text,
full
basically.
text. Yep. Island Ponder, classic blue-white play.
Alright, I'll keep this.
Yep.
Go ahead.
We're looking at some cards. We're rearranging the contents of our hand. Control player's going to play a land and pass, or play a ponder themselves.
I think that was incorrect. Go ahead.
Yep, says go.
Urza Saga. Now that's exactly what you want to be doing. Turn 2 Urza Saga.
I will respond.
Really powerful play.
Yeah.
Stifle on the fetch. Aggressive.
Aggressive, but it's nice. The land destruction here is good, and it allows you to sort of, with the turn 2 Urza Saga, you can start grinding for constructs if you don't have anything better to do, which is a great thing to be doing against control. You want to be doing stuff that you can leave up on their turn, and isn't going to get countered in a traditional way. We did just see a Stifle out of your deck, but that's not a control mainstay. So.
Yeah. Now we're seeing main phase Lorien revealed to play around another Stifle effect. Really smart from the control player.
Yeah.
Yeah, please check. I try to put it as best I could.
And a second Tundra from Stifle Knot.
And you don't always have to get the Dreadnought. Like, all these Saga decks, they can run, pieces that help them out in certain situations depending on what's wrong. Like, you can have Soulguide Lantern as we saw in the previous matchup. You could have Shadow Spear if you just feel confident enough with the constructs that you're making. You could run Pithing Needle if you're scared of certain synergies. That's probably not really what you're looking for in this matchup, but it's just an example of the utility of the card.
Yeah, so I do have the deck list in front of me, so I could tell you that the fetchable artifacts in the main deck are Lava Spur Boots, Shadow Spear, Retrofitter Foundry, and then Lost Jite, which is also another new card that I've been trying out. In the sideboard, there's an additional Pithing Needle and a Grafdigger's Cage.
I would be personally surprised if Lost Jite was a standout card here, but you can tell me about your experience with it, especially on the day.
Correct, yeah. This particular tournament, I actually didn't get to play Lost Jite, so I couldn't tell you. Looked like we're going to see a Lava Spur Boot being found. So, yeah, the Phyrexia Dreadnought was exposed there. It does look like double constructs being made. Another Urza Saga, which is massive, and then followed by an equipment here. Going straight to combat, swinging for a 7 damage, I believe. Really massive upgrade that these Urza Saga decks have gotten in the past set.
Yeah, I was skeptical of the boots because normally Shadow Spear represents an equivalent swing in any kind of race situation, but here in the turn 2 Saga situation, you wouldn't have had the mana to equip a Shadow Spear, and equipping the boots represents a lot more damage even with no other artifacts on the board. This looks great for Lava Spur Boots, especially in a situation where you're just relying on Urza Saga for artifact production.
Correct. I think the biggest standout of Lava Spur Boots is against those decks that are trying to deal with you with removal as opposed to blockers, right? So decks that are going to pressure your life total, that's where Shadow Spear becomes a better racing alternative. But in matchups like this, where you're really just fighting against how many Swords of Plowshares does your opponent have, the big difference maker is really the ability to swing more quickly, more often.
Yeah, and so these constructs are coming in hot, and the control player needs to find some answers and find them quickly. The other saga is in play, threatening to make even more, at instant speed, no less. So I'm struggling to even think of a combination of cards that the control player can have in their hand and feel good about the situation with.
The only out is Brainstorm into another into Terminus on the Stifle Knot player's turn. So maybe they can set that up here, but it looks like 4 constructs are going to be coming in on the next turn.
Yeah, so they have to Terminus during the Stifle Knot player's main phase, basically, to get all the constructs gone for good.
Correct, yep.
So we brainstorm.
Lorien revealed.
Yeah, so we're just getting rid of some bad cards. We haven't set up any miracles.
And there's the white mana that we need to set up the play that I was just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you get when you run a 4-color deck. You, especially when you get stifled early, you have to come scramble a little bit, get all your mana. This is representing full domain for something like Leyline Binding, but that's not there's gonna be enough in a situation like this unless you draw into something with the beanstalk triggers. Yeah, no, we're scooping it up.
There's the concession going to game two. So I can tell you from the Stifle Knot perspective, there's a Chord of Cunning in the sideboard, and then cards like Flusterstorm, Lavinia, even Rest in Peace. So might see Lavinia getting played. Lavinia really powerful against these bean decks. Just being able to take them off of Leyline Binding is really the difference maker. Being able or forcing out a force of will. Chord of Cunning attacks this deck from a separate angle, requiring an answer, and then giving you the Monarchy, which can be really powerful to just keep up with your opponent's card draw. And then potentially seeing some replacing of Force of Will for cards like Flusterstorm that don't necessarily 2-for-1 yourself. Force Will
Yeah,
obviously still really great in the Up the Beanstalk decks where it cantrips, but in really grindy matchups like this, the card disadvantage cannot be very beneficial to decks that don't run Up the Beanstalk.
yeah. It's easy to think of Lavinia as an anti-combo card, but Beanstalk is relying on being able to play higher mana value cards for less mana than you would expect to,
Yeah,
at least some of the time. So getting that Lavinia to stick definitely seems like it's going to be important for your game plan of getting 1 to 2 threats to stick and just hammering in with them.
yeah.
So,
And another big thing that people don't think about is you always expect your Beanstalk opponent to bring in Carpet of Flowers against you if you're a blue deck, and being able to keep them off of really big fourth AOlings can be really powerful as well.
yep.
That's my job.
If they're making 2 or 3 tokens instead of 7, that can be something that's much more manageable to deal with.
To what extent do you think it's useful to bring in Carpet of Flowers against a blue Saga deck, right? Like, they're going to run islands, but the effect of Carpet of Flowers isn't really going to be noticed until perhaps turn 3 or 4.
Yeah, we did see 3 Tundras, so we can expect them to be on a lot of at least blue-white islands. Um, I do think you bring it in. I don't necessarily know if you bring all of them in. You might only bring one in if you're running 2, for example. It, I guess, there's really only 4 to 5 lands that you expect your opponent to play that aren't islands, typically in a deck like this. So I think it still gets enough value that you would want something like a carpet.
What are the control players looking to take out in this list? So, because it doesn't really seem obvious to me that they have a lot of cards in their deck currently that are total bricks in this matchup.
Yeah, so I can tell you that my opponent actually managed or actually took out Swords to Plowshares in this matchup, which I told them after the round. I think that was definitely a mistake. Uh, Swords to Plowshares is just a super powerful card. I mean, granted, you only saw Urza Saga and nothing else from me, so you're not entirely sure what your opponent's playing. Not sure if their combo that just happened to have a backup plan, playing something like Cephalid Breakfast, but even then, Swords to Plowshares probably answers what your opponent's doing. I don't
It's the
remember what
most cheap
they.
and efficient removal there is. You know, it's certainly better than Prismatic ending in a spot like this, I would imagine.
Yep, exactly. Seeing another mulligan from my opponent here.
Yeah, it is always kind of terrifying to play against any deck running Stifle too, because there's just so many shortcuts in your head where it's like, oh, this isn't going to be important. You know, I'll fetch at the end of their turn. I'll like, do this and this and this. But then it's like, once you've seen a Stifle, then you have to respect the possibility of Stifle at any point throughout the entire game. And this is definitely, something I'm more hypersensitive to as a traditional Storm player. But
Just
you
so
know,
long as you play around the
any
corner.
deck that has triggered abilities, it's very easy to think of those triggered abilities as invisible
Yeah,
unless you're like really paying
and
attention.
and just as you said here, we see a fetch on the main phase to play around that stifle. So really smart from the control player. You've seen it once, you don't want to get hit by it again.
Yep.
And stifle is one of those cards that you really shouldn't run too many of or any if it's just to sort of mess with your opponent, right? It's not a super powerful card once your opponent knows about it because of how easy it is to play around. But if you can use it to forward your own game plan, like for example, what you're talking about of stopping a Phyrexian Dreadnought's ability from triggering, that can become super powerful.
Yeah, I have seen it in Delver lists that have been played against me, and it's been, it is still a good utility card sometimes if you're just using it for that reason. But yeah, you definitely want to be having your own synergies.
Yeah, I think it can be useful as a one or a two of for even if you just play it game one and then side it out. Now your opponent has to at least be thinking about it, so you can change their play patterns.
So we're going through the dance here. We fetched pondered, and then we're fetching again. Probably to play a beanstalk if we're spending 2 mana on something as the control player.
That's what I would suspect. Yes. And there is the beanstalk.
In longer games like this, it's always important to sort of like think about the control player's perspective. It's like you never know their hand, you never know their like what cards they're drawing or what cards they're looking at, but there's this sort of presentation that you have to sort of maintain where you want all of your removal to line up against the right things, you want to draw your cards at the right time, you want to present threats at the right time, and you want to have the right mana to pay for all these things. There's sort of a lot of pieces that need to fit into place here, and like it's easy to just sort of look at a game as it evolves and see how it's going, but much harder to make decisions that progress you towards those spots. So, without knowledge of the control player's hand here and what they're thinking post board, it's kind of difficult to assess the situation. They're going to play another land, they're going to pass the turn, and
Yeah.
you've got to see what's up here.
Yeah. I mean, and here we see a force on up the beanstalk. This is something I've been seeing more and more, which is aggressive forcing. As we saw, the beans player had to force back, and that's a cantrip they don't have. So that's just another powerful, those sort of slight edge cases. When you're a more grindy deck, countering up the beanstalk can really be important. And I guess to sort of feed off of what you were saying earlier, my opponent, cutting swords to plowshares, not necessarily a misplay, right? Remember, at this point, they only know that this deck contains Urza's Saga, so there can be reasons to make those decisions of, or it can be difficult to make the decisions of what's important interaction to have for my opponent.
Like if Urza Saga's in play, how many things are you going to be forcing from here on out? Protecting your own beanstalk, since you have the Leyline Binding in hand to remove something that the Siphonaut player is going to bring out. You want to be able to draw cards off of that Leyline Binding. That's just, especially if you don't have stuff in your hand to answer what's potentially on board right now.
Yeah, and looks like we're seeing a very similar play pattern to what the Stiflenaut played game one, which is make 2 constructs, fetch Lava Spur Boots.
Seems good.
Yeah, it
Control
worked out
player
game
knows
one.
about. Yep, and control players knows about it now. They have mana untapped, and we'll see what they do.
Another Urza Saga, so seeing the exact same game as game one, seemingly.
Binding.
All right, we're binding, presumably targeting the construct that the thing is equipped to. We're
Yep.
drawing the card off of the beanstalk.
And look, see, this is the power of Lava Spur Boots. You're still getting in on your opponent for 2 damage here, where previously you'd be getting in for 0. Those are the sort of differences that I think Lava Spur Boots is really going to make over the next couple months here as people discover it more and more, is just being able to continue to pressure your opponent, your control opponent specifically, is really massive. It's, I think, something that a lot of people are overlooking at this point.
You're right, but still consider the control opponent is at 15 life here. You've got a 2/2 construct and a Lava Spur Boots. You have another Saga to make tokens, but the clock isn't nearly as tight as it was last game simply because one construct got removed.
Yeah, this is very true.
Also, a sort of paper play tip for people: Leyline Binding. The draw card trigger wasn't missed, but you do want to make sure to do that one before it comes into play because the draw card trigger is a cast trigger and targeting the thing with Leyline Binding is as it comes onto the battlefield. So,
Yeah, Control player making a really cool play here, which is bouncing their own leyline binding from Teferi in order to get another cantrip off of the up the beanstalk. So just trying to see more cards here. Really smart and long games like this where you can afford to do it.
Yep. This is something that you'll see happen even in like games where Leyline Binding isn't getting a token, so that you can get more cards off of replaying it. But in this case, it did get a token, so you're not losing anything. You just picked up another removal spell and you drew another card, and
Yeah.
that removal spell is going to draw you a card.
And shout out to Ronnie again, kind of showed up at Legacy, picked up this deck for the first time, and just really did a great job, as did Trevin.
Yeah. And now we're seeing a main phase making of a construct aided by that lava spur boots to get in and try to kill Teferi. Looks like the one with ward is going at Teferi and the unprotected one is going at face.
Yeah, so you make, the same play, you do the thing, and you can because control player doesn't have a mountain here. Like they would be able to leyline binding the construct if they had full domain, but without access to it, they're kind of stuck. So
Right.
Teferi's gone. That construct will have to get removed another day potentially, and we're brainstorming for more stuff.
Well, also keep in mind, Lava Spur Boots grants Ward 1. So the only potential answer that the control player would have had would be flashing in a Solitude and paying for the ward once the equip resolves.
Or you could just binding the construct in response to the equip like you did last time.
Correct.
That's what I was saying. With the mountain, you would have been able to do that.
Yeah, fair enough. Speed Time, super powerful card. Destroys all artifacts. Makes a lot of sense to bring something like that in this matchup.
Gain 1.
Oh, okay. That's definitely a good sideboard card. That's definitely something you want to bring in. You've seen Saga, so artifacts are part of the game plan. But because of the clock, control player had to pop that before this saga gets to go off. So we'll see what comes out from it. Up there's Doorkeeper Thrall, so that's gonna shut off the enter the battlefield's effects, right? I think I know what's coming.
Yep. So no construct being made here. Instead, a Doorkeeper Thrall being played. Looks like there's a pause on the Urza Saga to ensure that it resolves, because once it does, the opponent can no longer respond here. So that is a 12-12 that just comes into play.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's the timing here is just really advantageous for the Stifle Out player because if they kill the Doorkeeper Thrall, you could just go get something else. You don't have to get the Dreadnought. So
Exactly.
it's much the same with Pithing Needle, right? A common line for Urza Saga decks that have Pithing Needle in them is like, well, if you let me grab the Pithing Needle, then I'm going to get to name something before you can do anything about it. So the correct time to make sure that you use your activated abilities on something like a Yawgmoth is before the Saga trigger resolves.
Yep. So now we see a force on the removal spell. Looks like potentially a forget to draw off the up the beanstalk. I believe that might get corrected here. I'm not entirely sure though. Surgical extraction targeting leyline binding. Just trying to reduce the amount of removal that my opponent has for me here. And there we see another leyline binding in hand, so that's a really big surgical.
Yeah.
The seed time!
There is another, what did you call it, a Seed Time? That destroys all the artifacts, but... Yep, there go the leyline bindings. So you have a 12-12 that's liable to get destroyed, but...
Yeah, that seed time definitely looks like it's a problem right now. 2 cards in hand for the Stifle Knot player. 4 seed time in hand for the control player. Looks like I see a Murktide. I don't know what the other card is. Tundra. Murktide Regent. Knowing that there's no answer to it at this point. Looks like that's a full 8-8.
Yeah, from my perspective, it sort of looks like the way this is played out is that Stifle Knot's sort of been able to maneuver so that the very few pieces of interaction they had were kind of used at the right time here to, back up their threats and, make it so that the control players sort of choked out. They don't have the clock, they don't have the cards, they haven't been able to draw too many cards off of the beanstalk to sort of compete. And um, without some kind of mass removal or some more card draw to help things out, they're really going to be stuck looking for answers.
Yep. And that seed time gets played, destroying the Dreadnought. Still coming in for 9 damage post that, though, from the Stifle Knot player.
Court of Cunning.
And a Court of Cunning. So now we're attacking from both angles here at the end.
So what does Court of Cunning do? I have not seen this card before.
Yeah, when it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative, and then, or sorry, you take the monarchy. I apologize. Different enter the battlefield ability. And then the second thing that it does is at the beginning of your upkeep, you can mill any amount of players for 2, unless you control the monarchy. Then that number changes to 10. So what you end up using it
Damn.
for is in these slow, grindy control matchups of milling your opponent for 10, since they don't have a good way to take the monarchy from you, and generating incremental card advantage along the way.
Yeah, that is a weakness of these control decks. I can't imagine a situation where he's going to take the monarchy and... I mean, we're already getting beaten down here. The Court of Cunning isn't going to be the win condition, but the monarchy just looks really bad for you here if you're the control player.
Right. Even if you have a way to get rid of the court, you're still dealing with your opponent drawing an extra card every turn.
Urza Saga.
We're surgically something. The stuff in the graveyard of the hand isn't really the problem at this point. We're taking a look. We're getting rid of the sagas.
3 more.
If we can board wipe, getting rid of the sagas is a nice solution.
Yeah, that would make it very difficult to rebuild.
But we're scooping it up. We were just taking a look with that surgical.
Mr. Draw.
And Stifle Knot takes it 2-0.
I believe that's Trevin on Delver, right?
Yes.
Should be. So we get the 2 winners of our 2 previous showcase matches squaring off against each other in the finals here.
Allow me to reintroduce myself.
How do we feel about Stifle Off versus Delver? It seems like 2 tempo decks that are sort of trying to interact in different axes. I kind of like Stifle Knot's chances here. If they stick a Dreadnought, it seems kind of hard for the Delver player to do something about it.
Yeah, no, if Dreadnought resolves, that's pretty much game over. But at the same time, Delver has Wastelands, it has tempo plays. So unlike the last match, the Stifle Knot player is actually the control deck in this scenario. It's a sort of later game tempo deck than a Delver deck would be. So now you'll see sort of 2 of the most powerful cards in Legacy facing off against each other, which is Urza's Saga versus Wasteland.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Delver player's biggest edge definitely seems to be the Wasteland here. You really want to take them off of Saga, and you really want to be able to threaten... Like, you have time to do that, even if a Saga is deployed. The Stifle Knot player really wants it to go to completion to fetch out Lava Spur Boots or Stifle or Dreadnought and get a bunch of constructs in play, so...
Yeah, exactly.
And you can't really rely on something like Doorkeeper Thrall as easily because Delver does have the Lightning Bolts to back it up. But, you know, as a Stifle Knot player, what are you looking to use your counter magic against here? Like, it's obviously going to be very context dependent, as a lot of these sort of tempo mirrors are. But what are the highest value targets traditionally?
So goal 1 is to try to keep threats out of play. Typically, you don't want to use your counter magic for that. You want to use your removal suite, which includes 4 Force of Wills, 4 Swords to Plowshares, and 2 March of Otherworldly Light, running that over Prismatic Ending because it's only a 2-color deck. But if you have to force a Murktide Regent, you force a Murktide Regent. The other thing you want to do is force through a Dreadnought, right? That's really your big hammer in this matchup. Delver does not have a lot of good ways to deal with a trampling 12-12. If you can get one of those into play on a turn where your opponent's not swinging for lethal against you, you're probably winning that game.
We already see Stifleot playing around Wasteland here by fetching 2 basic islands, just making sure that we have the mana to start cantripping off and setting up a good hand for that big turn. Because you just know that when Stifleot tries to get a Dreadnought into play, the Delver player, if they're smart, will have been saving a lot of their interaction for that point. So you better have enough interaction to back up your end of the deal.
Yeah. So not a lot of action from either player. We see the first big land that we were talking about, Wasteland from the Delver side here.
Yep, that really puts Stifleon under the gun. They can't even play a non-basic into that without getting threatened. And I assume that you as Stifleon are playing Wastelands of your own, right?
No, the color constraints are too much. However, something that I did do is I'm on all 4 Tundras in addition to one Meticulous Archive. And the reason for that is to sort of trick your opponent, if you will, into wasting that instead of an Urza Saga.
Yeah, that's right. Like, we were just talking about how it's important to know what's in your deck to try and make plays that would take them off of mana by either wastelanding them a bunch or like casting Besage or whatever. If you have more lands than your opponent expects, that can be the difference in a tempo matchup like this. They'll waste you a bunch of times, and you'll just come out there with more fetches, and it'll feel like a waste, so to speak.
Now we're seeing the third basic land here, so it's as opposed to the last round, Stiflenot's really treating this like a control matchup. Granted, so is the Delver player. We really haven't seen much of any interaction from either side at this point. And there's a big card. There's an Urza's Saga. I can't imagine that won't get wasted almost immediately.
Ooh, Spell Pierce, though.
Another spot where Spell Pierce is really big, right? I was hoping to bid out a Force Will or something of that nature, but not even 2 for winning my opponent really stings.
This is one situation, though, I think where even you played a bit too quickly, Nick, because one of the correct things to do if you're going to Wasteland a Saga is to waste it in response to the Saga trigger that gives it a mana ability, so that you don't even get to tap it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was worried about that. I was hoping my opponent didn't catch it, and I did give them an opportunity to pass on that trigger, which they did.
Yeah.
But that's a good catch on your end. That is a very important thing that would prevent that play from happening, right? I'm not going to play that Teferi into a Daze, for example.
Yeah. And, perhaps they wanted you to play because they had the Spell Pierce, right? We're level 2ing this sort of logical chain and getting there where now the Teferi's countered, and that looks pretty good for the Delver player.
Yeah, could be. Second Wasteland from the Delver player and Tundra in play for the Stiflenot player. Again, no real action happening. There's the first threat that we've seen the entire match. A lonely 1/2 flyer.
Yep. So it stops the ETB abilities. It's a 1/2 with flying. Does it have other abilities? I forget. This card's new enough that
It has flash.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're trying to resolve a Doorkeeper Thrall and potentially make it stick, perhaps that means you've got Dreadnoughts in hand after the card selection, which is a thing that you would sort of aspire to have, considering that Delver's got Wastelands putting you under the gun here. These sagas aren't going to stick, and you know that.
Now we're seeing the Tundra being tapped for a Ponder. Makes a lot of sense to tap the Tundra here, right? That's the source that can be wastelanded, so still keeping your non-wastable mana up for your opponent's turn, so you can't just be taken off of an extra mana source at the end of your turn.
Yep. Playing around an open wasteland is definitely something you have to get used to in pretty much any deck in Legacy. Almost no deck in Legacy is gonna have enough basics to make this not a consideration.
Yeah, for sure. And the Thrall's getting in the red zone. That's the first combat damage we've seen.
Yup.
And there's me forgetting that it didn't have lifelink. The previous
Some of these
version,
hate bears do, like what,
yeah.
Hushbringer? Yeah.
Well, in my defense, the previous version of that was run in Stifle Not was a 1/2 with flying and lifelink, but it didn't have flash. That was the difference.
Ah.
Bang!
Yeah, Flash definitely better here.
But fortunately, my opponent caught that mistake and we were able to correct it. And now we see a second thrall being played.
Which is nice because that's significantly harder to deal with if you ever try to play a Dreadnought now. You gotta get rid of both Doorkeeper Thralls if you want that
Yeah,
Dreadnought to die.
I fully agree with you, Ben. Being able to put my opponent into a position where they would need double Lightning Bolt or Force of Will makes me feel a lot more comfortable about playing a Dreadnought than just having one Doorkeeper Thrall in play is.
Pondering, still digging. Put him on top though so we find something. Looks like a blue card, so...
And there
Yep.
it is.
Yeah, so we were probably looking for a Force of Will or something to back up this Dreadnought. I mean, you remember this game. Was that what you found?
What does that do? Say 1 minute 12 12. When it enters the battlefield,
Opponent taking a look at that card,
it has a
seeing what's going on. It's a wild boy, let me tell you.
Yep.
or I sacrifice it.
It's big.
It has treble. It's the other keyword on it.
Yeah, I don't care about that. I mean, you resolve a 12 12. You have a 12 12. I guess I'm going to attempt to.
Opponents identified that they need to feed this thing to not resolve.
And there we see
And
Force
so
back.
you... Yeah. Yep, this is the fight. We were talking about it, like, Delver can't deal with this. You both have been sculpting your heads and preparing for it, but you both only had one force. That's a daze in the Delver player's hand, but you do have the 1 mana.
Yeah, that's really where this matchup can come down to, is does this Dreadnought resolve? Because once it does, it's almost impossible to deal with.
We could make an 8/8 Murktide and then exile something from the graveyard and then bolt it.
Yeah.
That's a mountain.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta.
That's really difficult to manage. More realistically, it's like,
Murktide.
more realistically, it's like 8/8 Murktide, and then we play another Murktide and make it a 13/13 Murktide.
Yeah.
There you go.
Outside of exiling 10 cantrips from your graveyard, it's very difficult to deal with this Dreadnought.
And you still have swords in your deck, so even that
Yep.
plan's kind of thin.
Two cards? I have 2 cards in hand.
Just a classic card, though, for Phyrexian Dreadnought. It's definitely one of the reasons why these Stifle Knot lists can be fan favorites sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to not love a 1 mana 12/12. With trample, nonetheless.
Yep.
And here we are seeing a Murktide.
This one's a small Murktide. That probably means that we're going to try and do the double Murktide
Oh, I
strategy.
see. So you exile 2. No, you're good. You're good. So why'd you tap 4?
Because you would want to exile... Oh, no, or did we leave Delirium? No, we left 2 Ponders in there. Yep, we are playing another Murktide. We are going to exile the rest of this graveyard so that both Murktides are going to get as big as possible.
Yeah, and you can double block, trade off a Murktide for Phyrexian Dreadnought, and that's super powerful.
Yep.
Combat.
Sure.
12.
Ow. Go to 2.
Phyrexian Dread.
Oh, it seems as though
And that's
Even
a
though the other
second
Murktide is a-
Phyrexian Dreadnought.
is a 3 has 3 counters on it. We didn't increment the first Murktide because it is supposed to get bigger whenever any card leaves your graveyard, and so casting the second Murktide is really, really good to pump up the first Murktide when you can. So you got to pay attention to your sequencing there.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I did not catch that in the game, otherwise I would have mentioned it. But yeah, you are 100% correct.
But yeah, I was just mentioning because it was good sequencing. I just think someone didn't tick up the dice when they were supposed to be ticked up, but it didn't matter. I mean, the second Dreadnought is just lights out. Even the
Yeah.
first Dreadnought still lights out because like we were talking about these double Murktide plays, you need 10 instants to exile in order for that thing to be bigger than your Dreadnought, and that just wasn't what was in the graveyard. There were only a few instants in there.
So now we're going on to game 2. I can tell you from my perspective, cutting all 4 Force of Wills, it's just a really bad card in this matchup. 2 for winning yourself in this really fast combo or this really fast tempo matchup isn't really where you want to be. Bringing in a couple Hydroblasts in addition to Flusterstorm and a Rest in Peace, actually. Rest in Peace can keep your Delver opponent off of Delirium in addition to basically making Murktide just a card that pitches to Force of Will. So it can be super powerful in sort of these matchups if you have your Swords to Plowshares and other removal spells to go along with it.
But you got to be careful. Once that Murktide's on the battlefield, you can't put Rest in Peace out there. Otherwise, you're going to exile all those cards in the graveyard and make it huge.
This is true.
But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like in these tempo matchups, you don't want Force of Will. You want to pay mana for your counter spells and not cards. So we're again gonna probably see you take the control seat here, try and get a Dreadnought in play with 4 to 5 lands and some backup, and hope for the best. But here, Delver player fetches a Volcanic Island and gets a DRC out. This is a strong start from them, so it's the classic start.
Yep, there's the best start they can possibly have, unless there's a bobble followed up with it.
Oh yeah. Even if DRC just milled a card, it would still be like very, very good in these styles of decks. But giving you the selection is just so important. Force of Will going down. Either we already have a Force, or it's just not what we were looking for at the time, or we just want Delirium. That's totally valid as well.
Could be digging for something specific as well, potentially needing another land.
That's true. And it is, it's a testament to the power of DRC that we still sequence it this way, even though we have Bauble Scalding Tarn, right? That can be another good way to, like, if you're looking for something specific, you can Bauble yourself and then decide to fetch now or fetch later based on what happens. But, like, DRC basically gives you the same amount of card selection while putting a 3/3 on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Get the Surveil land out there. That should be Delirium now because there's a sorcery, so...
Is that a Vendilion click in the graveyard that I see?
I don't know.
Tarmogoyf.
Oh, the blue card that's right below the Tarmogoyf.
I think that's Ponder.
That's
I think
Ponder,
it's Ponder.
Okay.
That's why I was saying there was a sorcery in the graveyard.
Yeah, seeing a Ponder and a Tarmogoyf get bid, no green mana at this point, so that makes sense.
Yep. Tarmogoyf notably also not as big as Phyrexian Dreadnought, even though it can get pretty big sometimes.
And
That's
here we see a Hydroblast being cast, tapping the Tundra. That's really respect for Wasteland.
Yeah. But, yeah. I mean, these are your red creatures. You wouldn't Swords the DRC anyway. We're protecting the DRC, so you did already have a Force in hand.
Pitching a Daze.
Yeah. Sort of respecting that you keep leaving mana up to play around days in these big moments. Surveilling
Another Daze gets binned.
Yeah. Been too many of those, though, and you let the Stifle Out player not play around days anymore, though, so you gotta be careful.
That's true. And DRC will live to see another day.
Yep, so it's still getting in there. But the Hydroblast has done its job if it's gotten some counter magic out of the Delver player's hand as well. Like, you're really just hoping to strip something, and so you cast Mind Rot here. That's about as good as getting this 3/3 off the board.
Yeah, at this point, not at a super low life total. I totally agree with you.
Still looking, still looking. Another DRC. I mean, this is kind of what the Delver player wants. We protected the first DLC, and we're drawing out counter magic to try and get the second DRC in play. So,
yeah.
If it stuck, it would have represented a significant increase of the clock. Potentially another 2 turns with bolts.
Yeah. So potentially not a lot of removal here, respecting the DRC that much. Looks like we will see an Urza's Saga, followed by a March paying X equals 1 to exile the Dragon's Rage Chandler.
Yep. So that's gone now. So we're back. We're back to the Stifle Not player having breathing room again. So
Yeah, and with an Urza's Saga in play, the Delver player really needs to find a wasteland here. Because the Siphonot player could potentially win this game without having to cast another spell.
and they've been digging pretty hard. They've surveilled a lot of cards to the graveyard. They've cast a bunch of ponders, and it doesn't seem like they have a wasteland because you'd surely use it here.
Yeah. And it looks like a Pithing Needle.
Naming wasteland.
That would be naming Wasteland, yes. So not even that's an out anymore. Opponent's still thinking about it.
Sure. Wasteland. Okay. Go ahead.
And there's a pass.
End of your turn, lightning bolt you.
Followed by an end step bolt down to 10.
That's aggressive. It's possible that a Doorkeeper Thrall could come out from the Eiffel side here. So that's either saying that we have another bolt in hand or saying that we really need to finish this game quickly. Because
I would agree.
that Dreadnought's coming out next turn if you have a plan to get it in there.
End step, I'll make a construct.
Yep.
Construct is deployed rather than Doorkeeper Thrall. That doesn't mean it can't come out here.
So holding priority on the Urza Saga trigger, really thinking about what to do here.
Cast Brainstorm.
Casts a Brainstorm in response. Now, one of the cool things that Urza Saga does is shuffle your library, so you can kind of get a free fetch land, so to speak, for your Brainstorm off of an Urza Saga triggering its third chapter.
Very nice. I think I see a Doorkeeper Thrall in hand now. As well as a Phyrexian Dreadnought.
In the tank on this Brainstorm,
One card.
One card.
Without a whole lot of mana and no window to play a land between, like, you know, the Saga's ability resolving and any of the counter magic that could come off with something like a Doorkeeper Thrall that you're trying to use to protect your Dreadnought.
Doorkeeper.
yep, and here, as you said, the Doorkeeper Thrall comes down.
Days.
So putting the opponent to the test. Looks like it's going to bait out Daze.
Real good.
Binning a fetch land from the Dragon's Rage Chandler. Daze will be paid for. Urza's Saga resolves. Pulling out a
Yep.
Phyrexian Dreadnought. So
Yeah, I
now
mean,
the
this-
tables have turned really quickly here on this Delver player, facing down at 12-12.
Yeah, this was a point where you taking out Force of Wills and putting in Flusters could have lost to another Force backup on this Doorkeeper Thrall because you were a bit choked on mana. But didn't end up working out that way. You got the Dreadnought to stick, and that's pretty much what you want to be doing here. So
I believe the Delver player only had one card in hand at this point, and now we see another
Pop Misty.
Urza's Saga from the Stifle Not player, really putting the screws on, honestly. The Delver player really needs to close this gap pretty quickly, and they are operating from Hellbent.
yeah, I hadn't noticed their hand size, and that is definitely one of the reasons why that Hydroblast play was so good. Delver has absurd card selection, but they don't have a lot of card draw. If you can get cards out of their hand, if you can leverage that advantage in the tempo matchup, that's exactly what you want to be doing. Doorkeeper
Yeah.
Thrall's done its job. It'll take the chump block here. Don't
Yep.
need to die to a bunch of bolts.
And another Channeler.
So this is still a strong clock from the Delver player. You're going to force the chump here from the construct anyway. I mean, you can't chump a trampler, but like you're going to force some amount of this.
Swords to Plowshares, and that's the scoop. Opponent would have gone to 3 there,
Having you bet them Goys was so rough.
Yeah.
and that's
They're really good against
another 2-0 for the Stifle Not player. That deck really came in powerful today from what we saw.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like, people were really expecting it. I mean, you never really do expect these kinds of things, but even if they were, I think, it ran into some decent matchups and, you played well as the Stiflenaut pilot. So definitely hats off to you there.
Yeah.
All right,
And
that's going to do it for our replay. Again, that was our Legacy FNM at PCB Hobby. Thanks to everybody that came out. And Nick, Ben, thanks for your help with the commentary. That's going to do it for
Wow,
us.
much appreciated. Thanks for having me.
always happy to support.